Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks. This week I'm going to be taking a closer look at a pedal which in the past few months since it's been released has caused more of a stir and more hype than pretty much any other readily available new pedal that I've ever come across. I think there's two reasons for this. First and foremost, the fact that it has more knobs than any other pedal I've ever seen in my life. And secondly, the fact that it is one of the, if not maybe the most expensive pedal currently available, at least overdrive pedal. If you hadn't have already guessed it, it is this, the much talked about Origin Effects RevivalDRIVE. As you may have noticed, there is a fair amount of stuff to get through with this pedal, so I'm not going to linger too long on the introduction, but I will say I'm not going to try and cover everything in this video because I will be for quite a while. But in the description box below, I shall stick a link to a series of videos that Mr. Simon Keats, the pedal's designer, has done on this pedal, giving you a full rundown, full kind of comprehensive look at all of its controls and all of its features. I'm going to give you some of my kind of preferred settings. I've been using this pedal for maybe a month now, getting to grips with it and getting to grips with what each control does. But I just wanted to give you a very quick overview and then in a conclusion section at the end of the video, give you my opinion, my pros, my cons, and ultimately try and answer the question, is it worth the hype? So before we delve in, first thing definitely worth mentioning is going to be my clean tone. As you can see, I'm using a Yamaha RevStar 502T with two P90s running directly into guitar rig on a clean orange amp emulation. Sounds a little bit like this. Really kind of nice, sweet, naturally dynamic clean tone, which is something I want to demonstrate about this pedal, which I absolutely love, is that it very much holds on to those kind of natural dynamic kind of touch responsiveness in your playing, which is very cool. So let's delve right in. We're going to be on the left hand side on the valve rectifier. Very, very amp-like in its response. There's a fair amount of gain dialed in there, but really kind of cleans up nicely just with a touch of your fingers, or pick. So, first thing definitely worth mentioning about the RevivalDRIVE is it's a dual-sided overdrive. A left-hand side, which I'm currently on, being a valve rectifier emulation, with the right-hand side being a silicon rectifier emulation. In a nutshell, the difference between the two, valve rectifiers famously inefficient, taking a little bit longer to recover in between notes, giving that kind of bloom and natural compression that you would maybe associate with, maybe a JTM 45 Marshall, something of that kind of style. The right-hand side, silicon rectifiers being famously more efficient and just being a little bit stiffer under the fingers consequently, taking less time to recover and just being a little bit kind of less forgiving, I guess. Personally, I tend to prefer the valve rectifier side, just being a little bit more spongy and a little bit more forgiving. But if you set both channels identically, you won't hear much of a difference. It's very much something that you would feel under the fingers. As I said, it's not so much a sound thing as it's a feel thing. And personally, I tend to prefer the valve rectifier side. Moving on to the controls, the first one is going to be the volume, which rather deceptively is actually the gain control. It's a cool kind of old-fashioned way, I guess, of labelling gain. So there's a fair amount of gain on tap in this pedal and really kind of does that I'm about to explode thing incredibly well. Personally, I tend to keep the gain a little bit above where it's set at the moment, which is at 12 o'clock, maybe at around the kind of 1-2 o'clock mark. Gives you a really kind of nice kind of natural sustain. As I said, it does that natural kind of responsive dynamic thing incredibly well. I can't think of many pedals where you would have that amount of gain, but really kind of be able to clean it up just with the touch of your fingers. If we ramp that up full, there is a fair amount of gain on tap. Not that I would use it like this, to be honest, but just to give you an idea. As I said, not that I would use it like that, but if you want to get that sound, absolutely nails it. Moving across, we have the lows control, which is pretty self-explanatory. That's your low end. First control, really worth mentioning, is the more presence control. Clockwise, from 12 o'clock through to about 5 o'clock, works as you would expect traditional Marshall presence control, adding that brightness. But moving to the left-hand side, we're actually dialing out negative feedback. I'm not going to give you an explanation as to what negative feedback is, because if I'm honest, I don't really understand it. But, as I said, watch Simon's videos about this pedal to give you a better explanation. But, in a nutshell, what I do know is that the more you move it to the left-hand side, the more aggressive it gets under the fingers, and the more famous amp for not using negative feedback is going to be an AC30, and it gets a lot more AC30-esque in its response. Apologies for the terrible Brian May impression, but hopefully you can see gives you that kind of aggressiveness and that immediacy of an AC30. Again, I tend to kind of prefer that. Rolled in very slightly, but just a kind of taste. Moving on to the bottom row, we have an output, which, as you would guess, is your volume. Then we have a blend control, which is rather interesting because that actually dials in the amount of clean tone, the clean signal rather, if you actually want any at all. I tend to keep that slightly backed off just to give you a little bit of kind of the natural kind of articulacy, is that a word? Articulateness, whichever, that you would get with a clean tone, but still giving you that kind of saturation of the overdrive. But if you want to dial that back, there's some really cool options for kind of some less gainy kind of, bluesy stuff, I guess. Also worth mentioning, the external Footswitch, which actually comes with the custom model with this, can actually override that. So if you want to set that as a kind of a little bit more clean tone, you can actually override that with the flick of a switch, which is very cool. The last control on the top panel worth mentioning is one, if I'm entirely honest, I can't see myself getting a massive amount of use out of, just because it's not something that I've ever become accustomed to in the past, because I don't think I've ever been running my amps loud enough to notice this. But for any of you that are familiar with running old valve amps flat out, you will notice something called ghost notes, which the best way to describe it is just to actually play it, and hopefully you will notice the kind of slight element of ring modulation almost coming in underneath the notes. Again, if that's not something that you've ever become accustomed to, it's a little bit strange, and I probably won't be getting the most use out of it, but to actually develop that feature, which is an actual characteristics of an old diamond valve amp, and capture that in a pedal is quite an incredible achievement. So I tend to keep that backed off. It is in there very subtly, but not so much to be noticeable, as the extent it would be if you had that dimed. Moving on to the bottom controls, the kind of little flick switches down here, this is where this pedal really comes into its own and makes it, as I said, just an incredibly versatile overdrive pedal. The idea behind this being you can pretty much dial it in to sound great with any amp, which if you're familiar with overdrive pedals, is not something you can do with, well, many of them, to be honest. Subconsciously or not, most overdrive pedals are developed with a particular style of amp in mind. The whole idea behind this, you can change the preamps, you can add the bright cap in, making it sound good with any amp. So, just to give you a quick rundown, from the left-hand side, we have the bright cap. To be honest, I tend to keep this in the neutral middle position, but just to give you an idea of what it sounds like if we play around with it. So straight away on the left hand side we actually have the Great British side, which introduces a lot more gain, and over to the right hand side then we have the US, which is a little bit more aggressive but nowhere near as much as aggressive as the Great British side. Moving across we have the preamp, again Great Britain, neutral and US settings. I tend to keep it, if I'm not in neutral, I'll probably be in the US side, to be honest. Again, it's kind of flicking between those, kind of when you want it to sound a little bit more like a Marshall or a little bit more like a Fender Blackface. It's just an infinite range of, or array of options, I should say. Does that kind of pushed blackface thing very, very well. Moving over to where the pedal really kind of excels, to be honest, is this reamp EQ section. So in a nutshell, if you're running into an amp which doesn't inherently have much bass, you would set it to EQ 1 and you'll notice an increase in bass. This particular amp emulation here, there's a fair amount of bass on tap anyway, so it's not needed. But flick that over to EQ2, works incredibly well. Also worth mentioning, this is the custom option, which actually gives you a load more controls on the bottom of the pedal. I'll insert a close-up shot here. Really able to fine-tune EQ2 in particular. Another cool feature of this pedal is if you want to run it into a flat response power amp and then out to an actual cab emulation. So say you were struggling with front of house and you wanted to just run it through your maybe MacBook out front of house to ensure great sound every night, you would set it to the power amp section. If I switch it to that now, obviously I'm running into an amp, so it's not going to sound great, but if you were to run that into a impulse response, it would sound very cool. There's actually a video I did for Origin, which I shall link in the description box below, showing you the kind of comparison between an actual Marshall 4x12 and an emulated Marshall 4x12. That's really interesting. You'll notice it's very bright to obviously compensate for the kind of natural darkness of a cab. So if we flick that back to EQ2, worth mentioning the controls along the bottom as well. I haven't actually got the external Footswitch plugged in at the moment, just because, to be honest, I ran out of jam jars to rest the pedal against behind here. But worth mentioning that we have a mid-frequency push here. So say you wanted to kind of really kick out for solos, that works incredibly, incredibly well. A really cool feature. We have a dry gain control, so if you wanted to actually increase the amount of dry gain available on the blend switch, you have that. Definitely worth mentioning the bright cap cut here. So if we flick back to the Great Britain side of the bright cap, you can actually dial back the amount of brightness in that, because if there's one kind of common complaint of bright caps, I guess, is that they are inherently quite bright. So there you have it, the sound of one of the most expensive overdrive pedals currently available on the market. I think the difference between this video and a lot of the other worth the hype videos that I've done is that with this pedal, the hype is kind of real, to be honest. It's only been out a few months, whereas a lot of other videos that I've done, hype is kind of a byword for reverence or esteem in maybe which that pedal, amp or guitar is held. But with this pedal, it's only been out a few months, and pretty much since Origin started posting about it on Instagram and on Facebook, there's been a hell of a lot of talk that has followed it round. And I think your reaction and ultimately your response as to whether this is worth the hype is very much going to be informed by whether you've had any prior experience with Origin. For me personally, I've been using the Kali 76. I bought the Kali 76. It's actually that pedal show special edition, serial number 2, from a couple of years ago, and is hands down the best sounding compressor pedal that I've ever used. It was worth a pretty penny when I bought it, and it still is. Although they have slightly dropped their prices on those since they've been more successful. But in that respect, I've had nothing but fantastic experience with Origin. I've actually been to Origin HQ and done a couple of videos, which I shall stick links below, to videos of this pedal, kind of trying it out and getting some initial sounds and seeing what I've made of it. I think if you've not had any prior experience with Origin, or maybe the Kali 76 or any of their other pedals, your initial response to this would have been to balk a little bit at the fact that it is so expensive and it has so many knobs. And if there's one criticism I would level at this pedal, I think it probably would have been a great idea just to put a more simplified, at least whether they were the main controls or the kind of sub-controls, high, middle and low. Obviously there's the lows control, and there are ways of controlling the mids and the highs with other kind of variations of controls, and I personally love the way that the controls are so interactive on this pedal. But I think for the layman, a high, middle and low control probably wouldn't have been the worst idea. But as I said, your opinion on whether this pedal is worth the kind of 500 odd pounds that it retails for, and whether it's worth the whole kind of hype that has followed it around since its birth, is very much going to be based on A, how much disposable income you have to blow on an overdrive pedal, and B, whether you've had any prior experience with Origin. For me, I think the amount of work which has gone into this pedal is absolutely incredible. Simon is patently an absolute genius, and I think as much as the word amp in a box is very liberally bandied around in the pedal world, this is as close to an amp in a box, without it actually being an amp in a box, as you will ever find. Creating the circuitry and creating the kind of, you know, the power stages and all that kind of stuff which you would have within an amp, actually within a pedal, is just quite an incredible achievement, to be honest. I think its price will always put a certain amount of people off, but if you're willing to spend the money, you will get one of the most reactive and one of the most kind of versatile overdrive pedals. I think that is probably the most versatile pedal that is currently available. As I said in the video itself, this has been designed to sound good with any amp, which I don't think is something that you can say of many overdrive pedals, if any, to be honest, at this point in time. That's a bit of a kind of vague answer as to whether it's worth the hype, but as I've said, I think with most things it's very much dependent on your reaction to it and your opinion. So there we go, make of it what you will. For me personally, it's on my board, I love the way it sounds, and it's probably going to be there for a very long time. So, as ever, this has been Friday Fretworks. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. I'm Chris Buck, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you next week for another episode of Friday Fretworks. Cheers guys, take care.